Okay, I think we'll get started. As I said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people joining from many regions today. Welcome to everyone, and welcome to the webinar, Crisis or Catalyst, Asia's Take on the Future of Aid and Development Cooperation. I'm Anthea Mulakala. I'm the Senior Director for International Development Cooperation at the Asia Foundation. I'm pleased to moderate this timely and important conversation. We're meeting at a moment of profound disruption in the global development landscape. Official development assistance declined in 2024 for the first time in 6 years. The donors we know, the traditional ones, are pulling back, multilateralism is under strain, and funding decisions are increasingly shaped by national interest and strategic competition. But amidst this disruption, Asia is not simply responding, it's recalibrating. And for decades, global development frameworks, often centered on donor-recipient roles and technical solutions, have guided much of our thinking in this space. And these have brought important resources and structure. But they can also constrain how we imagine alternatives. So this moment offers an opportunity to broaden that view by drawing more deliberately on Asia's own policy innovation, institutional experimentation, and development leadership, perspectives that can meaningfully shape the future of cooperation. So today is about widening that frame. It's about surfacing perspectives from Asia that challenge, complement, or completely reimagine conventional modes of cooperation. We're asking, is this upheaval a breakdown to be managed or a breakthrough to be seized? To explore this, I'm thrilled to be joined by a panel of speakers who each bring a unique and grounded perspective. Swarnam Wagle, Member of Parliament in Nepal, is an economist with decades of experience at UNDP, the World Bank, and in national planning roles. Pat Low is Chief of Markets and Deputy CEO at AVPN and has worked across the spectrum of capital, from commercial finance to philanthropy, to drive inclusive development in Asia. Roland Raja, lead economist and director of the Indo-Pacific Development Center at the Lowy Institute, leads Lowy's work on aid, development, and economic resilience. And Poppy Winanty, professor of international relations at Universitas Gadjah Mada, is a leading scholar on South-South cooperation and Indonesia's role in the evolving global order. We'll also hear later from Nicola Nixon, my colleague and the Asia Foundation's Senior Director of Governance, who will join us for the audience Q&A. So please drop your questions into the chat box throughout the discussion today, and we will be curating them for a session at the end. So let's kick off. Let's begin with a round of quick-fire reflections from the panel. So I have a simple question for you, but it's going to be provocative. So from your vantage point, in or focused on Asia, is this moment in development cooperation a crisis, a catalyst, or something else entirely? Swarnam, let's start with you.
Thank you, Anthea. So we're obviously going through an upheaval, and the sort of 80-year-old post-war kind of regime is definitely changing. But and I noticed that with the collapse of USAID, for example, it's been a bloodbath for the thousands of those who've been directly employed, but for the hundreds of millions of the general population, the citizens. I think the message is really that the aid paradigm was crumbling, and it needs to be reoriented, reimagined, recalibrated, as you said. There's this famous quote from the Italian novel, the Leopard, right? If we want things to stay the same, you better change. So I think we're very much in that moment. A few things I want to note is really that the ODA, the traditional ODA, as defined by DAC and others, was declining in relevance. The global economy is now almost 100 trillion, well, over $100 trillion. You take 20% of that global pie, almost 20 to 30 trillion of domestic public expenditures is really what drives development outcomes or shapes development outcomes. FDI, cross-border flows, almost $1 trillion. Remittances to developing countries alone, $700 billion annually, with minor ups and downs. And ODA has been stagnant at around 200 billion, right? Even at its peak, it's around 200 billion. So in this global scheme of things, of a $100 trillion global economy, really ODA was already a very small thing. It mattered 30, 40 years ago when ideas for change, development catch up was largely coming from the West. Human assets, I remember in Nepal, up until the early 90s, even secretaries in aid agencies were imported. You had to be English speaking, Western, etc. And there was scarce foreign exchange, right? Very little exports. FDI was scarce. Remittances was almost non-existent cross-border. So, development grant was really what mattered. But that world, that landscape has fundamentally changed and shifted. So in the era of this declining relevance, then additional sort of cynicism crept in, right, on how really effective is ODA. People refer to the Marshall Aid at that time was only sort of $13 billion. In today's money is probably $130 billion, transformed Europe, transformed the world. Lebanon is supposed to have received $170 billion over 20 years after 1993. Yet, look at the impact. So on the efficacy, how effective all this was leading to, all of us. Anthea, you and I co-edited a book. I mean, I contributed a few chapters to a volume that you edited on South-South. So we're already discussing in an incremental fashion, but with Trump and the recent sort of US upheavals, and domestic backlash, right? Politicization. You can no longer count on how the domestic constituencies are going to behave. So all this is now leading us to a discussion where we question or even anticipate new sources of aid, the new modality of aid, how we govern it, the more private sectors, the mission delivery of aid, how we deliver, and the scale of aid, right? From both the challenges and that shift from millions to billions to trillions, that discussion. So I look forward to discussing more along these lines, but that's sort of my big picture.
Great. That's a fantastic opening, because I think what you've revealed to us is there's all these other sources of finance that have been out there that we haven't really noticed, that are incredibly important for the region and the world. We've been fixated a little bit on ODA. So thanks so much for that perspective. Patsy, and I'm going to turn to you with the same question, because coming from, the private sector and the corporate foundation perspective, how do you see this issue?
I think it's a really great question, Anthea, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. It's difficult to follow such esteemed comments from Swarnim, but I think it's really important to highlight that there are multiple pockets of resources actually that we can still access when it comes to our development goals for this region. The question is, do we know where and how much is that? So if you're thinking about whether or not this was a bloodbath or a catalyst, I do see this as a catalytic opportunity, but it's not something that is all rainbows and sunshine. We have to understand that that is catalytic also needs incredible amounts of courage and risk-taking appetite in order to work through that opportunity. So just to put it in context, and with some numbers, right now the estimate for closing the SDG gap, funding gap in Asia Pacific is hovering between 1.5 to 1.7 trillion dollars. Now, if you look at the rising wealth in this region, both from a corporate and private perspective, and the opportunity for philanthropic growth, you can see actually what the opportunity is. Assuming that we apply the current standard of giving, say, for example, from the US to Asia, right? Typically, the standard of giving in the US is about 2% of GDP. Right? If we apply that to Asia's GDP, that actually unlocks close to $700 billion a year. Now, that's effectively half the funding gap, if you think about it, just purely from a theoretical numbers point of view. So AVPN, as a network of social investors and social investment enablers in this region, currently having over 600 organizations in this space that is intending to move capital towards impact. Among our members, that already accounts for close to 500 billion worth of capital that they are moving towards impact in Asia. So I think the opportunity here is real, but how do we tap on that, and how do we ensure that the private sector and the development sector, as well as policymakers and government sector, work effectively to realize this opportunity? Therein lies the challenge.
Fantastic. I think that's very encouraging. The challenge, as you say, is who has the courage and the appetite to really and to enable and mobilize those resources. Thank you for those insights. Roland, coming from your perspective, more of a, research think tank, and you've done a lot of work on this. How do you assess this question?
Thank you, Anthea, and thanks to Swanim and Patsy, and really great comments to follow on. I'm just jotting down things because I think they were really excellent opening remarks. I mean, I think crisis or catalyst. I guess I think we know that we are in a crisis, and I think that's worth just to be a little bit negative for a moment dwelling on, because without that you don't get the catalyst. Trying to improve things, trying to make things better. I mean, that's not going to happen automatically. And in fact, I think, if one's a betting person, you have to say that the outlook is actually uphill for doing that, right? Without really significant concerted action from a range of actors and really realization, I think, on the part of publics in all countries and, of course, their policymakers and leaders of what's at stake, then the things that need to happen are not going to happen. If we talk about what kind of situation we're in, I mean, obviously, the development aid industry is in a crisis itself, but I don't think we should focus strictly on that. We should focus on development. From a development perspective, we are facing a crisis. We've just gone through COVID, wars, there's ongoing debt problems in many countries, economic shocks. All of this is set back poverty reduction, health and education outcomes, and progress towards the SDGs, which was already off track. Now, if we then turn to the financing gap that Patsy already mentioned, right? We already knew that was huge, and it's gotten bigger because of these shocks. We've got to layer on the climate challenge as well on top of that. We've got to keep in mind at all times when we're talking about Asia, it's both, very fundamentally, it's not just adaptation, it's also mitigation. Asia is a huge source of growing emissions, and so the world has an interest in seeing that addressed. It's within Asia's own interests to do something about that. If we add all that up, that takes you now up to $3 trillion a year. That's needed at least globally. So you're talking about very, very large numbers. And then we're not heading in the right direction. Obviously, we've got aid cuts rather than a scaling up going on. Now, to continue with my negative vibes here, I mean, Swanim and Patsy both mentioned, alternative sources of financing. In our research, a lot of what we've tried to emphasize is, a little bit of realism and in two directions. One, obviously, unlocking those financing flows for development has always been very, very hard. Blended finance, private capital mobilization, it hasn't delivered the dividends yet. I think it's still something we should continue to focus on because it's where there is traction for doing more, but we also have to be realistic about what it probably will end up achieving, especially when we're talking about some of the hardest areas of development, the lowest capacity environments, when we're talking about delivering of health and education, where the adaptation projects, where realizing any kind of return, even a below market rate return, is very, very difficult, right? These are areas that require basically grants or pure philanthropy in order to work. So some realism around some of these other financing sources. Remittances also very difficult to mobilize that specifically as a financing source as opposed to an income source. And then on the other hand, the importance of public finance through ODA and other sort of non-concessional public finance. In our research, for example, looking at Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is a region you wouldn't describe as being overall aid dependent by any means. But when we tally the numbers, of what we call official development finance, that accounts for, it's a small share of GDP, absolutely, but it's still 10 to 15% of infrastructure, health, education, social protection spending in big countries like Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam. So you're talking about something that's actually maybe not that big relative to a measure like GDP, but actually very important when you're talking about investments in development. So I think, when we're talking about these things, not all about financing, but we start by recognizing there is a very big financing problem. The second thing I wanted to note is that, it's not all about financing. It's about the quality of those investments and cooperation. And it's even more so about the policies and institutions within countries in Asia and elsewhere, right? Because we know that's what ultimately determines the ability of countries to develop and prosper. On the quality of development cooperation, I think the problem is that theoretically there is the scope that as the aid quantity goes down, we focus more on quality. In reality, unfortunately, quality and quantity are both driven by the same thing. They're correlated. They're both driven by the reality that donors are taking their eye off the need to focus on development, right? And so that's why we look at countries, donor countries that have reduced their aid budgets drastically, like Australia did in the past, like the US is doing now, which the UK has done. That comes with the getting rid of independent aid agencies and a loss of expertise and institutional capability to prosecute and promote development. And so, unfortunately, quality of development tends to go with the reduction in the quantity of development assistance being provided. And I think the other element is that most of this, as I think Swanim alluded to, most of what matters is ultimately going to be determined by what countries do themselves in terms of policies and reforms and how they spend their own money and raise more domestic revenue. I think the difficulty is that, one, there are already a range of negative trends in many countries in Asia in that regard, including erstwhile successful ones. And secondly, we look at the global environment. This is really enabling the wrong kinds of policies in many ways. Many countries look at the protectionism coming out of the United States and indeed many other Western countries and conclude they also should be indulging in their own sort of protectionist instincts, or maybe they just think that clearly history has proven that to be the correct response, which many economists wouldn't agree with. And similarly, when it comes to, say, domestic authoritarian tactics, which are now seen as more permissible, and certainly there's less external pressure around many of those issues. And so I think on both the quality of aid besides the quantity, and then on the policies in countries as well, the trajectory is a very difficult one. If we recognize that, then I'll end it on the positive note very quickly, then maybe that can be the catalyst for doing things differently.
Thank you for giving us a little bit of a reality check there. And I think you're absolutely right that we need to look at beyond the numbers, and quality is something that can be lost when quantity is lost. So very important consideration. Poppy, from the Indonesia perspective, I'm sure you have, you're kind of looking out at all this happening. Indonesia is such an important country in the region. I'm sure this has been in the discussions that you've been having with counterparts in Indonesia. What's your take on this?
Thank you, Anthea, for the questions. And also, first, I'd like to thank the Asia Foundation for inviting me for this important webinar with such prominent speakers. I think I learned a lot from Swarnim, Patsian, and also Roland's comments earlier. Obviously, it's an honor for me to be here. And in response to your questions and the theme of this webinar, I want to highlight the recent phenomenon by focusing on the emergence of the emerging donors. Before, I'd like to respond with the Indonesian experience, but I think it's crucial to see what's happening recently from the perspective of the emergence of the emerging donors. If we view the global aid system solely through the lens of traditional donors, especially considering the significant kind of budget cuts in the aid from the countries like the US and some European countries, it is understandable that the outlook may seem pessimistic. If we perceive that the global aid system as primarily kind of relying on recent inward-looking policies from major economies like the US as well, we are likely, in my opinion, to miss the bigger picture. This kind of one-sided perspective also reflects the unfairness of our interpretation about what's going on. While I believe this kind of point of view is also justified, particularly since the global aid system after World War II, as Swarnim mentioned earlier, that was mainly characterized by the North-South kind of relations, with the global North mainly as the donors and the global South as the recipient. So it is essential to understand the recent development by examining various aspects, particularly the role of the emerging donors. The rise of these donors has become, in my opinion, increasingly kind of observable over the last few decades. Emerging donors, I think we should understand that why then we come to these terms. The emerging donors mostly related to the developing countries or the countries that are characterized as the developing countries, but now they have started to also develop their own sort of like international development programs. So on the one hand, we also see that the situation where we are familiar with the traditional donor countries with their international kind of development aid programs. We are familiar, even though now it's being dissolved, like the US aid, AUS aid, JICA, even like the German agency for the international corporations, including COICA, and you name it. However, similar agencies are also, in our opinion, are emerging from developing countries. For instance, like Thailand has its own Thailand International Cooperation Agency. Turkey has its own, like the Turkish Cooperation Coordination Agency. Brazilian government has its similar kind of program. And including recently, Indonesia is also establishing similar kind of the agency with the Indonesian aid or Indonesian Agency for International Aid. So the existence of these agencies, in my opinion, and their more active kind of involvement in the global aid system provide at least giving us a little bit kind of optimistic kind of perspective or point of view. Even though I understand totally that, as Roland mentioned earlier, that we need reality check. We need the questions regarding their capacity, their size, and even some sort of like funding available from this kind of agencies coming from the emerging donors. However, again, if we have to discuss the global aid system, and then we put this kind of new emerging sort of like countries and emerging donors, we may have the opportunity to see what is happening now as much more as the catalyst and opportunity instead of just a crisis. I guess I will stop there. Thank you, Athena.
Thanks very much, Poppy. You're right that, I think there is an opportunity now to pay much more attention to emerging donors, as you say, and some of them have emerged quite a while ago. If we think of India, for example, or even China, and those narratives and practice will become much more important, and perhaps really shift kind of the traditional narrative into kind of a new era of cooperation. Fantastic opening round, and thank you so much. Different insights from the group. I'm going to move to the second round now, and here I have individual questions for you. I'm going to go back to Swarnam again. So the traditional aid system, which you mentioned, is shrinking, as you said, and some would say collapsing. So who in Asia stands to gain most from this disruption, and who is most at risk of being left behind as the traditional aid landscape shifts?
Yeah, so obviously the two giants in Asia, China and India, very much in the picture. But you rightly mentioned, I mean, they've been engaged in South-South cooperation even when they were dirt poor, right? When per capita income wise, China was at $200 or $300 per capita per year. It still was a fairly generous sort of, but it was more channeled in the name of South-South solidarity. But now, it has the heft at $13,000 per capita. The global aggregate clout that countries like China and even at India is much poorer at $3,000. Still is a $5 trillion economy. And so, they obviously will have to take up some of that, pick up some of that slack. But it's not straightforward. And I appreciated Roland's point about how we do need to do the reality check. So, we have China to the north and India to the south. Now, you'd think, the tide would be lifting us, quite dramatically, but it's not automatic. There are problems with their own baggage and legacies there. BRI, certain issues, even with Indian assistance. Some of the problems that we attach to, Japanese or even European aid, this tide aid is still prevalent. So a lot has to be done there. But having said that, because of contiguity, because of this sort of regional proximity, and co-benefits in terms of trade, middle-class tourism, FDI, all that, I think they will, grow in prominence. But the more interesting action is going to be on the exiters, right? So you are talking about the Indonesias, the Malaysias, the Thailands. So those countries who themselves didn't rely too much. I mean, American, the Western aid, but they picked up. They married trade investment, and other forms of financing, private sector being leveraged in the development process. So a lot to be learned there on how countries have actually, the Miracle 13 growth economies that Michael Spence documented a decade ago, didn't rely too much on aid. The starting point was catalytic, so there's a lot to be learned on where aid can really give us that spark. But the rest of the story is largely domestic. And where aid has had a corrosive effect on countries like Nepal is, breaking that social contract that you need between the state and the citizens in terms of accountability for real domestic-driven development needs. That often crumbled when the dependence grows and the elite is largely responding to donors rather than their own citizens. So that part. So in terms of gaining, so China, India, obviously, but the middle income countries and even laggards like Nepal, sort of now being forced to look for alternatives. And remittances, I just want to mention that traditional aid in Nepal started in 47 with US coming in, eradicating malaria, engineering large-scale migration, etc. But between 95 and 2025, so last 30 years, Nepal's extreme poverty rate declined from 55% to less than 1%, largely due to remittances. What was traditional aid doing at this time? I don't know. It's a mixed record, and some would be quite skeptical, right? This is at the $2.15 sort of rate. Even at the much higher middle income, sort of $6.85, we've come down from 90% poverty to less than 50%, which is a much higher bar, right? So I think, but who are the losers? It's going to be the fragile states with no plan B. And this is the Afghanistans, this is the Myanmars, I think are going to be stuck. But having said that, the relevance of, as we talk about catalytic ODA, there's still continued merit for having ODA channel to what some scholars have called ring-fenced core priorities. And in the case of Nepal, the USAID withdrawal, or rather abrupt withdrawal, I was thinking, where did it hurt us most? It was in the nutrition agenda. So it's not so much poverty. Remittances, the private inflows have taken care of that, and some public expenditures. But on nutrition, where you need to reach that last mile, these deep pockets of poverty and deprivation, ODA could have played. I mean, the state can step in, but it has multiple demands, multiple claims on its resource, right? So I think even in countries that are exiting and looking at these opportunities, there will remain areas where ODA will need to be targeted. But it's really on a more wholesale macro level, it's this sort of failing or flailing, as Lant Pritchard used to say, not so much failing, but flailing states that has to be looked into, I think. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. I was really struck by what you said about the social contract and how, perhaps in the Nepal case, aid has led to the deterioration of that. And perhaps in some of these flailing states or, where aid has been such a critical factor in those economies and in their development, that whole governance issue of rebuilding and building that social contract and taking responsibility for those issues is going to be extremely tough. Yeah, point well taken. Thank you.
Can I take 1 minute, Anthea? I don't want to eat into my time,
You
but
may.
I just, for the delivery, something new has come up, right? So I was looking at Karthik Muralidharan's work on the state capacity, right? And this, so how do you, even the scarce or the declining relevance of aid, how do you get the max out of it? And there's this interesting distinction there that can be adapted, hopefully, to this new paradigm of ODA that will hopefully emerge. So even flailing states, weak states, with very low capacity, including the mighty Indian government, they do certain things very well, right? So mass vaccinations, conducting peaceful elections covering 650 million people, hosting these amazing global summits, etc. And responding to disasters, right? There's certain things that even this weak, crumbling state does very well. That's because it's on a mission mode. It has a clear goal, it has a clear deadline, and we know how we measure success, right? And the same state sort of crumbles when it comes to routine delivery of education, drinking water, electricity, good governance, day-to-day public provisioning of services. So I think that distinction of delivering development on a mission mode can also be now, will have to be carried forward. So it's not so much as we imagine the sort of a new paradigm. It's not just the new sources, the Chinas and the Indias, the AIIBs and new sources, of which I think Roland was rightly skeptical about, that they've not delivered, just like traditional ODA also didn't deliver, right? None of the committed pledges were ever met, and that eroded a lot of trust actually. But as we look at the new sources, new methods, and obviously the new challenges in the context of Asia, which as people have been pointing out, the global public good agenda, cannot be left alone. So maybe the ring fencing of core objectives on poverty, on growth, issues like nutrition, etc. And then obviously the third pillar being the crisis and the humanitarian sort of sphere. When we conflate all this, then you get all this reshuffling of aid and confusion, which you've written about. But if we have a framework where you say, okay, core priorities, global provisioning of global public goods, which benefits everyone, and then the third is crisis, humanitarian, peace building, all that, then I think we're heading in a direction. But not just the sources, but also methods of delivery, governance, the overall modality. I think these are sort of the new terrain that we need to navigate.
Thank you so much. Speaking of new resources, Patsion, Asia has incredible wealth in its private sector and philanthropy, but can this genuinely step up to address the most acute development needs, like the ones that Swarnim was just referring to? Or will relying on private money inevitably lead to a focus on profit and less on the most vulnerable and complex challenges? And if we are so much looking at private sources now, there's got to be that tension and that pressure amongst the private sector actors as well.
It's a good question, but it's a provocative one, Anthea. And I actually am very struck by what Mr. Swarnim just mentioned earlier about this framework of the development goals, right? So if you've got acute, critical, crisis-centered type support that's needed, and then you have core provision and development outcomes that you're looking for in terms of the populace and the economy. I think when you're talking about engaging with private sector, we have to think the same way as well. So meaning that it needs to come from the perspective of thinking that when there is good development outcomes for an economy, it is only a good thing for business. And business recognizes that. So in many ways, if we're thinking about how we're mobilizing private sector resources, we shouldn't let the red herring be, oh, is it profit seeking? In the long run, and increasingly we're seeing a trend of this among businesses recognizing that if you don't put your profits and your capital towards purposeful development, your business is not going to succeed anyway in the long run, right? So I think there is that increasing awareness for that. What tends to be the tension is when you have this inability to sometimes rationalize between a short-term or a longer-term outcome that the business may be looking for, or its stakeholders may not be able to rationalize the same. And this is where I think it's important, just to earlier on Roland's point, that we have to inject some realism when it comes to engaging with private sector resources, right? We have to recognize that if you're going after capital that is looking for financing, that is intending to do investment, there needs to be the economic outcomes and the impact on development outcomes you're looking for needs to travel in the same direction. It doesn't necessarily mean that one needs to be bigger than the other, but they have to travel in the same direction. And on the other hand, if you are intending to seek private sector resources for some critical public good related type support, then you will also be looking for the private sector resources that would see benefit in putting the investing in those types of outcomes. Case in point, the private sector typically has two lenses to looking at these opportunities. One is looking at opportunity, so where is growth potential? And then the other one is looking at risk. How do I mitigate and manage risk, right? If I was a foundation or a philanthropic organization, the opportunity for me has to be much more around the longer term contribution that I can make towards causes and issue areas that I care about. If I was a company and I was looking to maybe look at sustainable models in serving the last mile in very critical services like financial services or education or technology. I want to see long-term growth potential for my investment in my business in this marketplace. If I was a humanitarian organization, or if I was looking to fund the resilience building and disaster reduction risk of a country, I'll be looking to make sure that the infrastructure is going to have key outcomes with respect to how responses can be better when a disaster hits. So the recognizing that the goals and the investment need to travel in the same direction, I think, is a very fundamental awareness that we must have when it comes to engaging with private sector resources. So it's not quite as simple as, quote unquote, whether or not it's making profit. That's one key point I wanted to mention. The second point that I wanted to mention is that, and this is to Poppy's point about the emergent leadership that we're seeing now in South-South. When we're talking about private sector resources in Asia, it's also not a monolithic, homogeneous group. We're talking about a mixture of family businesses, conglomerates. We are also talking about the economic potential and business model potential and value chain potential of the 71 million MSMEs in Southeast Asia, for example, right? We're also talking about the financial growth that's been growing, and investment growth that's been happening in this region between the major financial markets of in Shanghai, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and so forth. So when we're looking at all of this, when looking at this mixture, we recognize, though, that the way that it emerges in Asia is unique and different from how it had been in the traditional global north. Right. Typically, what we've seen, just using philanthropy as an example, is that the Asian style and modality of philanthropy tends to apply a much longer term view about the kinds of outcomes that it will be seeking. It tends to apply a lot more relational view. So there is more interest in being contributing back to communities where the organization or the family would be doing business in or has roots in. There is a much more awareness and almost a requirement around trust building, around relationships that they can build with each other. There is also an awareness of some of the nuances that may be perceived by Global North as risk, but is actually perceived by Asia, by South-South, as context. For example, in terms of the risk that some may see around lack of documentation, but there are contextual reasons why that's the case, and therefore the Asian leadership in this space will then be looking for innovations to address this issue, right? I'll give you an example. One of our members in AVPN, which is an impact fund called Elovar, they've been investing in the economic opportunity in last mile communities in India, and increasingly now towards the rest of Southeast Asia, for South Asia for some time. They've rolled out something very interesting called EPIC, EPIC, and I'm happy to put the website in our chat box, which basically attempts to quantify the economic opportunity that is emergent with what they call entrepreneurial households, right, in South Asia. So that means, for example, your typical middle to low income, characterized as middle to low income household, which is millions and billions of them in India. They are not considered a population for rescue. They are not considered a deficit part of the economy. They are an economic engine if you're able to support their growth adequately and within the right way, the needs that they have. And what they've done with EPIC is that they've actually attempted to quantify that in terms of the GDP potential, the economic growth potential, and it becomes actually a market call. So it says that if you actually, it tells people that this is the opportunity if you are investing in this. And data will show actually with this entrepreneurial household spending, this entrepreneurial unit spending that takes into account that the typical developing market entrepreneurial household is fluid in its nature for how it uses money. It is also very innovative about where it generates income. It is very on point with where it's going to utilize technology, and it's very much around just in time, using what's appropriate to meet the needs of the moment. That type of model is not something that traditional investment is used to, but yet if you're able to see this as a economic opportunity, you can unlock so much more private sector resources that will be investing in that. And you'll see actually the data over time that even through crisis that would hit the emerging markets, the entrepreneurial household opportunity stays quite consistently growing. And this is a perspective that I would love to see Asian leadership from private sector resources really bring out to the rest of the world, because this is unique about how South-South can see the growth opportunity for us.
Thank you so much. I think your comments really pointed to the need for us to get a lot more granular in terms of how we think about private funds, philanthropic funds, funds that come from family offices or entrepreneurial class in different countries. Thank you for those insights. Roland, as national interest and geopolitical rivalry increasingly drive funding decisions, is the idea of international development cooperation for mutual benefit dead in Asia, replaced by a transactional system where countries pick sides based on who pays?
Thanks, Anthea. I mean, it's a very big sort of question because it's driving a lot of things these days. I mean, I think to say yes would be over dramatic, right? I mean, I don't think it's anywhere near that kind of extreme, but I think it is important to recognize that geopolitics, it is dominating the development discourse. That's one. And two, it does present very real issues that will be costly for development unless they're actively addressed. And I don't think we are yet at the point where proper consideration has gone into that. I think we have to recognize, particularly people that are coming from more from the development perspective and been doing this for a long time. It's easy to sort of say, oh, there's all this distortion now coming in from geopolitics to effective development, instead of recognizing that actually geopolitics has always been a part of how development cooperation has been done in terms of the funding decisions, but also in terms of the policies, the priorities, and the embedded ideologies that have gone with development cooperation projects. So geopolitics has always been there. We should recognize that. That gives us some hope as well. On the negative side, when geopolitics has been more important, such as during the Cold War, the studies conclusively regularly show that development wasn't going so well and aid was less effective. And it was the end of that period that allowed for development cooperation itself to become much more catalytic. Right, so geopolitics does then impose costs on development, and I think it relates to what I was trying to say earlier in terms of, there are so many different priorities and incentives, and also the attention to the quality of the project, and in terms of what kind of policies and institutions are being encouraged in the countries that a donor might be working with. But I think ultimately it sort of goes to what Swanim was saying, which I thought was really, really great comments. It depends on the context at the end of the day. And so you could easily argue that, okay, we've got this overly donor-driven, supply-driven, westernized development cooperation ecosystem. And so geopolitics is helping to make them more receptive to the receiving countries and their priorities. And if that's true, then that can be good for aid and its quality. On the other hand, you could say, well, okay, the donors are just trying to curry favor with the local political elites and do the things that they want and not do the things that they don't want. So, such, for example, Asia Foundation do a lot of work in civil society. That's always a sensitive area, or gender issues, these kinds of things. And of course, as Swanim noted earlier, the political elites as well can end up playing a game to attract the funding. And that's disconnected from what might be best for the people. So you can tell a story that goes, either way. I think history shows that on average, there's a lot to be concerned about. I think if we're talking about Asia, there's a slightly more positive story. I mean, as we've repeatedly come up in this conversation, Asia is a growing region. It's doing quite well. It is very far from aid dependent nearly everywhere. And so, you've got a fair bit of capability. What donors do is not going to dramatically sway the situation in many countries, and that's a good thing. It means that donors can focus, even where donor quality might be going down, the countries themselves, if they're able to say what they need and want, they can manage that, right? And it can work. I think it can work reasonably well. It's in the so-called flailing and failing countries where things get very, very dicey. Where aid makes a big difference, the quality of the projects matters, and it's going to shift incentives and how political elites in those countries might behave. And so that's the kind of thing we need to focus on. I don't think we've got good solutions, unfortunately, is the problem. There hasn't been a good sort of, no one's worked out a strategy for how do you manage a world where actually we really want to do both. Ideally, we want to promote sustainable development in Asia, across Asia, but we also want to play geopolitics at the same time. And any sort of recognizing of all countries' interests would recognize that that both these things are going to need to coexist. If I was to offer, my 2 cents on where the solution lies, I think the solution is first, accepting there's going to be, and always has been, there's just going to be more of it, a fair degree of geopolitical transactionalism into how development cooperation is done. But what we haven't solved is, because that's already happening, the transactionalism, what we haven't solved is how do you ring fence or ensure that this doesn't crowd out promoting longer term interests in sustainable development and addressing GPGs and global public goods and these kinds of issues. I think, certainly, whether or not country, what the emphasis the donor countries are putting on quality of development matters. But I think the multilateral system is very important in this regard. This is where a lot of the norms are set. This is where a lot of the agenda is set. This is where institutions like the World Bank, UN, World Trade Organization, World Health Organizations, all these entities set the agenda and the direction, and it flows through. And it's they're not protected completely from geopolitics, but they are more insulated and mandated to be more technocratic. So I think there's options there, but we also see that that's exactly a pressure point right now. And so I think, Asia is big. It can contribute to these discussions. It's got to think about what does multilateralism look like. That would be in Asia's interests.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up the point about multilateralism. I think it really is an important one, and we haven't really talked about that yet. But yes, it is that system, we could argue, is in crisis, but there's also really an opportunity for Asian countries to get more involved in the multilateral system. And also to your point about hedging, let's say, I do think that Asian countries tend to do it quite well when they're trying to deal in amongst geopolitical rivalries, and there is a lot that can be learned amongst Asian countries and how they do that, and they don't always follow necessarily the same approach or same strategy depending on what the situation is or what's on offer. Poppy, in your situation, with the rise of Southern voices and models like South-South cooperation, which Indonesia is heavily involved with, from Indonesia's perspective, is it time to kind of ditch or get rid of the aid concept entirely? And in what ways are recent shifts in the landscape influencing Indonesia's own donor identity, priorities, and partnerships? Indonesia has been in the development game for a while, has been considering its role as a development partner for a long time. Where is that thinking now?
Well, yeah, thank you, Anthea. It's a challenging question. Yes, I'm kind of mixed feelings to respond to your questions, because I believe with the rise of the emerging donors, the concept of aid probably may no longer be suitable as we observe kind of not only different mechanism, but also because of the development, international development projects also have been blended with other kind of aspects like investment, trade relations, and then market access. So that's why that probably just aid will be kind of difficult to maintain. However, again, at the same time, I don't believe that it should be entirely kind of dismissed or probably abandoned. Now we observe more or less kind of diverse global aid landscape, as emerging donors display distinct characteristics, limitations, and also approaches to delivering their development aid programs. So that's why we see which probably also different with the conventional international aid as we understand it. So the first thing regarding the mechanism, there will be a combination between the existing sort of mechanism like North and South, the one that I mentioned earlier, that North as the donors and then the South is the recipient, which will be still existing. That one mechanism. However, we also see the South-South cooperation, which will be in the near future and the longer term will be much more prevalent. However, we cannot also forget that there will be another mechanism, what we call as the triangular kind of cooperation. The one that the Indonesian government, due to its limitation as well, has been developing this kind of triangular cooperation when we see that the global north and the global south are together in delivering the project kind of, development projects together. So it can be seen like at least the landscape will be much more diverse with the global north, global south, south-south cooperation, and even like the triangular cooperations. That's the one thing. And the second aspect that we can see is different sort of like principles to be implemented. Unlike the traditional donors, that we also have to admit that the method of delivering international aid typically kind of imposing certain kind of conditions. Say, for example, adopting the liberal kind of democratic political system, or embracing with the free market system and things like that. However, the new development in the global aid landscape may not have similar kind of conditions. So we will see what we are going to see in the near future, or probably later on, is the less or fewer kind of interventions in the domestic affairs. We can see whether this is good or not, we will see later. But then there will be different aspects that less and less, probably fewer, when we're developing or implementing the development projects with the kind of tight aid or probably interventions in the domestic affairs. And last but not least, I think with based on at least Indonesian experience, the future of the global aid will also exhibit kind of combinations between something that driven mostly by the norms like solidarity, inclusive growth, and also like bottom-up process in delivering the projects. However, at the same time, at least again based on the Indonesian experience, we also see the combinations with drive more by the pragmatism as well. Developing countries, when they're emerging, as the emerging donors, also have to consider the limitation they have, not only in terms of the limitations regarding the financial aspect, but also the domestic support. Indonesian case shows that how then a developing country, Indonesia, when started to implement that the international aid program, got also criticisms domestically. So we also receive some sort of like legitimacy. Why then developing countries like Indonesia have to involve in this kind of global sort of like involvement regarding the global aid system? So that's why combining and managing, balancing between kind of the norms aspect and also more pragmatic kind of the motivations. So that's why getting the legitimacy from the domestic actors, that includes, as the Patsian mentioned earlier, also domestic private sectors. So the developing aid and also the projects, and especially using developing countries' experience, we'll see a combination between the drive within norms and also the more pragmatic kind of aspiration. Thank you, Anthea.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you mentioned triangular cooperation, which is something that has traditionally been quite difficult, but I think with this changing funding environment, it might be something that gets elevated and perhaps more effort will be put into it. And noted on, the norms, because there's been a lot of funding for democracy programs that came from the US government, for example. Without that now, we might see a real shift in how things operate. Okay, we are running behind because that was such a rich discussion we just had. So I'm going to ask you one further question for our second round, which all of you can answer, but please try to keep it to 2 minutes, and then that will allow us to have time for questions. So in this round, we're going to go the other way. So Poppy, catch your breath because I'm going to turn to you first. If development cooperation is to truly be reimagined, what concrete, perhaps radical steps must the Asia region take now to ensure a new system serves Asian priorities rather than just adopting to a new set of external rules? And what are the biggest barriers to making that shift? 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Athena. I try to answer very short. The first thing is, as I mentioned to you earlier, that whether the system is broken or not, again, depends on our standpoint. And if we receive that, again, the global kind of aid landscape solely from the perspective of the traditional donors and conventional methods in delivering of international program, that yes, probably the system is going to a broken kind of situation. However, when we are going to focus on differently, we will include the emerging donors in the debate, we will see different kind of landscape. Of course, this new situation is also not without the reservations. The emerging donors have limitations, including domestic support and legitimacy in performing its international roles. And therefore, in order to make this kind of new landscape will be much more successful, it is very important for developing countries to balance between gaining and securing domestic support with upholding their own normative standards in delivering the roles. In this case, I think it's crucial to develop South-South cooperation also beyond ASEAN. So as I mentioned to you earlier, probably they are not going to just accepting the external rules, but they're going to have different kind of rules and different kind of mechanism in implementing the programs, including also trying to, develop it under the terms of the triangular kind of cooperations. The biggest challenge, in my opinion, if then these emerging donors will be also actively involving in the new system, obviously is striving sort of like, making sure they have the capacity, making sure they have the legitimacy between or within their domestic kind of audience, and they also have to have more substantial role in the global aid landscape. I guess that's my response to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Roland.
Yes, thank you. I'll try and be very quick. I mean, I think we have to recognize that it's still very early days in, and there's very profound shifts going on, not just to do with development cooperation, but the entire sort of global economic and political security order. And so that means also it's important to think about how to shape that, right? And what early sort of moves can be done at this point. I think for Asia, I mean, the starting point is it needs to sort of make the case of its centrality and importance to any discussion around the future of development cooperation and achieving all sorts of global goals. It's still ultimately where the bulk of humanity resides. I mean, yes, the extreme sort of poverty is now increasingly concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, but if you lift that bar just a little bit and look at people that are still economically insecure, then the bulk of them are going to be found somewhere in Asia. If we talk about global public goods, and the most obvious ones being climate change and preventing pandemics, then Asia is absolutely central. The global battle on those two fronts will either be won or lost in Asia. And if we talk about strategic importance, I mean, Asia is the center for China, US, China, Western geostrategic rivalry, but it's also the center of where most of economic growth in the world is coming from. It's also where all supply chains and most of what we use is in terms of manufacturing goods is made. And so it's got that kind of importance that should be leveraged. Third thing I'd say is building on some of Poppy's points there is around acting as more of a bridge, right? I think Asia has that potential to act as a bridge between your traditional South and North. Most of the strong, successful economies that have done well are to be found in Asia. They've got the status and the legitimacy. You're talking countries like India, Indonesia, Korea, they're in the G20. They can play an active role in bridging between major powers and the so-called North and the so-called South. And also, as you yourself said earlier, Anthea, in terms of China and Western relations, in terms of how to balance the hedging, yes, geostrategically between the two, but also the hedging between, or maybe the intersection between security and development, which is, I think, something that Asia has had to grapple with since day one, but also, and all countries do, but also done very well in that regard. The final thing I would say, all that means is Asia does need to step up in two ways, I think, to be a center of a greater center for cooperation, multilateralism and global public goods, delivering on those things and increasing their own action. I'll stop there. Maybe I was too long.
No, some heavy responsibility on the shoulders of Asians. Thank you. Pat.
I would like to suggest that there are two things, particularly from a private sector perspective, that we need to think about. First is that let's also break out of the traditional global north archetype about what is private sector. If we look at, for example, still the prevailing most active philanthropic entities in this region, they still tend to be, for example, foundations that have been started in the global north. So I would recommend that let's unpack what it means when we're saying private sector resources in Asia. Look at Asia-based and Asian-born businesses, foundations, investors, financing that should come from Asia to be able to drive this. And we know that there's tremendous growth there. The second thing I will call for is that let's also break out of the traditional global north archetype about how the cooperation should happen. And to Poppy's point about the triangular cooperation, to my earlier point about how relational models are different, the trust models are different in this region. Let's be innovative and empower our various stakeholders in the public sector, in the private sector, to think out of the box and look for more creative solutions where you could see financing being more innovatively designed and held to different benchmarks that have not been defined by the historical global north. And let's look at these kinds of opportunities where we can lead in that innovation. We know we've done it in so many other solutions when it comes to development, when it comes to fintech, when it comes to services, when it comes to education. We can certainly do the same when it comes to, and I hesitate to use the word aid, but I think we can certainly do the same when it comes to innovating the way that assistance and development investment can be designed for the future.
Positive. Thank you. Swarnam, the last 2 minutes are yours before we go to questions.
Thank you. I'll try to be quick. So on the 3-pillar framework of sort of ring fencing core priorities and global public goods, let me set aside the humanitarian angle for now. On global public goods, I think Asia is now big enough. Earlier in the trade discourse, we used to worry, all these regional blocks, are they going to undermine the multilateral trading system? And then there was a solution that said, okay, hang on, the regional blocks are here to stay. So let's work on multilateralizing regional blocks eventually and then contributing to them. So a similar analogy would work here. So as global, compact is fraying, undergirding of the post-war order is, sort of being compromised, we need to come up with Asian versions, right? And here we don't need to start from a clean slate. What happened after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the Chiang Mai initiative, currency swaps, etc. New institutions came up, but they didn't substitute global institutions. AIIB famously, adopted all the good things, adopted wholesale all the norms that were set 50 years earlier by the Bretton Woods institutions, etc., but got rid of all the bad things. For no need for a resident board, for example, which was so colonial and so 1950s, right? So those examples on trade blocks, they just mimicked what the Europeans did. So with the ASEAN success, BIMSTEC, RCEP. So I think a lot of that has to be now, doubled down on and accelerated upon, because the global public goods on an Asian scale are still almost global, right? Climate crisis, Himalayas. I live in Nepal. The melting of the glaciers, etc., exhibit A of climate change, right? Communicable diseases. We saw how Asia actually did exceedingly well during the pandemic in terms of response, because there's distinctly Asian examples that have been dealt with the West and almost forgotten. Safe use of technologies, AI, all that. Nuclear, cross-border terrorism, which in South Asia we saw flare again in recent years. So regional public goods on an Asian scale would almost be global. And we would ultimately multilateralize these regional objectives. So let's get going on that. What are the hurdles? Internationally, geopolitical tensions, and even these emerging big powers still interested in their respective spheres of influence, so may fragment these pan-Asian cooperation. So that's something to be realized, and that's already playing out in certain sectors. I'm not going into. Domestically, though, now I'm a politician and I can speak with authority that unless it is domestically costly to not act, these things don't happen. So, what you agree in Bangkok, if it doesn't resonate with your political voters in Kathmandu, it's not gonna. So it has to be politically costly for leaders not to act for some of these issues that transcend borders to really be effective, right? So that's on around the regional and global public goods. On the second, it's really the agency is largely domestic. Countries have to step up, and this is where ODA and our own taxpayers' money need to be catalytic in crowding in private resources. That doesn't happen to the scale that was promised, but we need to do much more of that, and we need to learn from countries that have done this well, because there's no alternative. $200 billion of ODA in this global economy of $100 trillion. It is nothing. It was nothing, and we need to look to these new sources. But that will not happen automatically, as I mentioned at the beginning. And countries have to step up to really, and maybe the ODA, the easy money not coming in, will force countries to now really look into these options.
Thank you. Just reinforcing the point that it is a catalytic moment and agency is there. It just really needs to sort of be lit. Thank you. That was excellent, and we are back on time. Nicola, welcome. I hope you're feeling better. Nicola hasn't been well, and she has offered to moderate the question and answer. I saw a very busy chat box there, so I think there are a lot of questions. So please share the questions with us, and we have about 15 minutes for questions with the panel.
We do. We have 15 minutes. We are back on time. Thanks very much, Anthea. And thanks so much to Pat, Roland, Swanim and Poppy already for an amazingly rich discussion. We've had a busy question and answer session in the chat. And there's particularly been quite a lively conversation on Nepal. We have quite a few participants here from Nepal, which is excellent. I'm sort of clustering and summarizing some of these questions a little bit, and some of them seem to lend themselves to being asked of one particular participant or panelist, but everyone is very welcome to contribute a response. I will start with some of these questions on Nepal, but one in particular because it's relevant to other countries in the region. So there might be other perspectives on this question. And it comes to what you were already saying, Swanim, about the incentives for Nepal to be leaning in to helping shape the future of development cooperation. And Poppy's already touched on some of these ways in which countries could position themselves in terms of the influence on future development cooperation. And Roland, you were talking about countries acting as a bridge and these kinds of things. And this question comes from Prayat, and he's asking, so specifically for Nepal, Swanim, how do you envisage Nepal positioning itself, not just as an aid recipient, but as an emerging contributor or strategic partner in regional development efforts? So really, what would you envisage that Nepal could or should do to be in that sort of positioning as a contributor?
I think on certain issues, we have the credentials to punch above our weight. So when it comes to climate, 8 of the 10 highest mountains in the world are here. We support 10 major river systems that supports the livelihoods of 2.5 billion people, etc. So Nepal is seen as the custodian of the Central Himalayas, and I think, but the challenges cannot be met by Nepal alone. So this is an area where we can carry that global mantle. So on the area of climate, on certain micro level community-led development efforts on community forestry, community radio, etc., and community-led sort of efforts to fight poverty, Nepal also has a lot of success stories. But on balance, of course, we're the second poorest country in Asia, so we can't pretend to do too much. And our challenge is really ensuring good governance on the bedrock of good governance, really accelerating development, right? And I've been talking about this concept of missing GDP. So if we had maintained in the early 90s, after the first burst of economic reforms, the trend sort of growth rates of that era, 7%, 8%, we would today become a $100 billion economy. But because of conflict that let us adrift, all the political instability, corruption, bad governance, we today are only a $45 billion economy. So where did that $55 billion vanish? That's the price we as a society are paying for bad governance, right? So this rhetoric has really again, shifting the agency to inwards. It's not some external assistance, the US, Europe, Japan, World Bank, ADB lifting us up. It's the agency is ours. We let this $55 billion vanish, and we remain a poor country. But that has to be fixed on the bedrock of good governance. It's a political agenda. That's why I'm in politics. A lot of young people are in politics. And then we have to shortlist the key drivers of economic progress. So in Nepal's case would again be clean energy, landscape marketing, including tourism, green revival of manufacturing, but tied to very much to the regional and global production networks, high value agriculture, and IT in the era of digitalization. So if we zero in and prioritize these 5 areas, FDI can come in. A lot of the diaspora wealth can increasingly be channeled, but again, with some ODA and some public expenditure playing that catalytic role. So you invested 10 million with a way to attract 100 million of private capital. That's really the way, but none of that will happen without good governance, and that's really the roadmap.
Thanks very much, Swanim. I'm just wondering, Patsy and Poppy, Roland, anything you'd like to add on the ways in which countries can be strategic partners in regional development efforts?
I would just say that I am very struck by the figures that Mr. Swanim had just mentioned. And one of the things that I do wish that there was more transparency about, which will help us better understand the role that we can play here as countries in this region, is that we need to better understand how private sector capital is a potential resource for this type of development coming from this region. So I mean that to say that, if we were able to quantify the potential resource that could come from private sector investment by companies in this region, if we could quantify the opportunity for philanthropy from this region, I think then the way that we would envision how emergent donor nations are coming from this region will change. And I say this as an example, looking at Poppy for Indonesia, the level of collaboration that we're continuing to see between governments and private sector players in some of your key development outcomes, whether it's digital financial inclusion, whether it's in education, even in terms of sustainable agriculture, it's symbolic. It's not without its challenges, but it's symbolic of how we can see that that synergy, and which will then lead to amplified resources that can emerge from that country. So I think we need to look at that as a new framing for what we mean when we say that there is that level of emerging donor opportunity from this region.
Thanks very much, Patsy. And I'll move on to the next question, actually, which sort of riffs a little bit off what you were saying. Navaz asked a question that we can explore both in terms of public and private financing, I think. She asks, as India and China expand their roles in development cooperation across Asia, how might their differing political models influence the types of initiatives and partners they choose to support? And what could that mean for the broader development landscape in the region? I know this is something that obviously, Roland, you're thinking a lot about at Lowy. I wonder if I could start with you on a response to that question.
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. I think at the end of the day, the incentives around lots of different emerging donors are not necessarily well understood, even China. I think there's always a lot of discussion around what China's incentives are, what its interests are, what its strategy is. I think the more careful work, which I know Asia Foundation, Anthea, you've done some of this as well yourself, shows that there's many different objectives and many different elements, and there's probably not an overarching strategy to what is going on either. And so I think it's important to recognize that. But then turning to the nature of the question, what's the implications of that? I think often the result is that the implications are often perhaps unintended. And so one of the concerns, for example, with a lot of China's financing is that it might encourage corruption, for example, or cause other problems in countries, or it might cause debt problems in countries. The idea that this is the intention going in, well, that doesn't seem to stack up with the evidence. But the idea that that's the outcome coming out, I think there is a lot of evidence that that's actually what ends up occurring. India, there's been less sort of scholarship around, you know, what the sort of impacts are, and at the end of the day, their development cooperation is much smaller. I think the interesting thing is much more so where, you know, in both China and India, they have got something to offer in terms of technology. I think this is the really interesting thing. India, obviously, on the digital and IT side of things, has been promoting, you know, learning from its Aadhaar and its digital stack and these kinds of things. China is actually being able to leverage in companies like Huawei and others. BYD, I mean, BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, is much more than anything that you would call development finance. And I think the question is, what kind of standards and norms and implications does this come with? And does it potentially lock out other players? I think at the end of the day, we hear a lot of speculation around the potential for these things. To be honest, I don't see concrete evidence of that, but you can see how these are possibilities.
Thanks very much, Roland. And I saw quite a bit of nodding of heads. I wonder, Pat, also because I'm realizing I don't actually know an awful lot about the potential of Indian or Chinese philanthropies. And so I'd wonder just a little bit if you had any reflections on the private sector dimension of that question.
I think they're both powerhouses in their own right when it comes to private sector resources, but they're designed and governed very differently. So that has implications for how private sector resources can move. China philanthropy, for example, in our observation, has up until now been very much more focused on activating domestically. Although then this is the unique characteristic of private sector resources. If we look at potentially what the philanthropy potential is from Chinese companies that are operating in the rest of the region, that may have a different perspective. And the other opportunity which we're also observing, which is that when we look at countries like China and India, also there's a tendency to think it's a homogeneous India is a homogeneous China, when actually the reality is that particularly and we're seeing this coming more out of India as well, between the private sector companies and their CSR and philanthropy and impact investing opportunity, as well as the increasing prominence of state governments and state governments' own resources in engaging with the region and investing in the region, that there is opportunity for us to be quite creative about what this means and be innovatively designing the way that these collaborations can happen. The last point I wanted to make real quickly, because Roland, you mentioned the India public stack and the Aadhaar and technology related to that, is that we also sometimes overlook that it doesn't have to be financial in terms of how private sector is contributing to some of these development outcomes. There is non-financial, there's technical, there's intellectual expertise, there is research, there is data that can also come into play. And we sometimes don't look at that as a significant resource, and I think that would be a missed opportunity otherwise.
Thanks very much, Pat Zien. We have one more question I'll ask. We have a couple of more minutes. So I'll just ask one more question that came in, which I think is a really interesting one as well. There are reports that the United Nations, well, apparently The Economist is saying that the United Nations could run dry of funding by the middle of the year. I don't know if it is that stark or not, but we all know that the multilateral system is being squeezed. In a future where multilateral agencies like the UN are less part of the picture or potentially out of the picture, what would development cooperation and aid look like? And how different or messy do you think things might get? I'm going to ask Poppy if you want to tell us a little bit about what you might respond to that question.
Yes. Thank you, Nicola. I also heard similar kind of, sense or nuance that the UN kind of agencies are in the very difficult situations with the recent development again, because we have, I think the global has been relying too much on the sole kind of hegemonic power, to be honest. So that's why when the hegemonic power is becoming less benevolent, then it's creating kind of chaotic situation. So in terms of the in connections within the lack of the financing to the UN sort of like agencies with the global aid landscape, I suppose with some sort of like ideas with the emerging of the emergence donors, and then with the private sectors, and then some sort of like other initiatives beyond the existing or conventional ways of delivering the international projects on aid and international development projects, then we will see there are some other opportunities. Probably the reason why we haven't thought that much is because, again, we are relying too much on the existing or the conventional ways of delivering the international programs and international aid. So once I believe it was Roland mentioned earlier that once we had a crisis, then it started to it forced us to think beyond the boxes, beyond the existing situations, and responding to Patsy earlier. I think the private sectors also have been contributing, and then the matter is just how then it make it more efficient, how it make it work, and how it being implemented with the current situation. Thank you, Nicola.
Thank you so much, Poppy. Thank you to all of our participants as well for putting questions in the chat. I'm
Nicola.
sorry, we couldn't get, sorry.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to add a really quick point to what Poppy
Sorry,
was
Pat.
saying, because
Please go ahead.
I think it's really important, and I want to call back to something that Mr. Swanim mentioned earlier about the importance of governance, especially when we're talking about engaging with private sector resources. And there is always a concern that by engaging with private sector resources, we're introducing potentially divergent objectives or different agenda. And the one point that I want to make is that any organizations that looks to have this kind of triangular-based multi-sector form of collaboration needs to have at its core strong governance, because that's the only way you can ensure that the agenda and the objectives that you want is maintained. And I'll say the same for private sector resources from emergent donor nation that is working to a recipient nation in this region. You know, and it's the same for public sector programs that are trying to engage private sector funding. If without strong governance, you always stand the risk of your agenda getting sidelined. Really important, and I just want to call that out. And it's everyone's own responsibility to empower themselves to do that without you know, challenging whether or not resources may have influenced our objectives in one way or another.
Thanks very much, Pat. And sorry, I didn't see you jumping in there to respond to the question. So I'm going to hand back to Anthea, but thanking also our participants for adding their questions to the chat. And again, saying sorry we didn't get to all of them, but hope that you found some resonance of some of the responses that you were looking for in the discussion anyway, which has been incredibly rich. Back to you, Anthea.
Thanks, Nicola. Those were great questions. So we're going to have one more lightning round to wrap up, and then I'll give a brief summary at the end. So you've got about 1 minute each, and you don't all have to answer. But we haven't talked about financing for Development Conference 4, which is coming up later this month. So looking ahead to that pivotal conference, I would say, at this time and beyond, what is one key message you'd like global leaders or development actors to take away from your perspective? I'm going to start with Roland here.
So we all didn't have to answer.
You don't.
I think
Pass.
I think the unfortunate reality is a very difficult timing, because we're so early into massive global shock to the system. And this is a once in 10-year event. I think at the end of the day, just achieving anything at the Financing for Development Conference might be something. I think the extent that leaders and delegates can hold the line, and going back to my original sort of comments on this discussion, tell it like it is as much as possible. Having the Trump administration there will be difficult, but I think telling it like it is, the situation, what the costs and what the priorities are, is the only way that we're going to have a constructive way forward. That'd be my one thing.
Thanks. Anyone want to jump in? Swarnam, go for it. Or Pat.
Mr. Swanim, go ahead, please.
No, I actually led Nepal's delegation to FFT3 in Ethiopia 10 years ago. And I was looking at the Addis Ababa action agenda. Not much to show there. So I guess, yes, I think FFT4, a very adverse global climate, obviously. So revisit what worked, what didn't work, why it didn't work, why we were not able to pull off those lofty ambitions and goals from 10 years ago. Moving on, I think, yeah, be very realistic about the new sort of geopolitical terrain that we'll be inhabiting for the next few decades. Build on some of the good things that have happened that we'll be carrying on from the legacy that will carry on, on terms of norm setting, the issues of transparency, accountability, some of those good governance elements. I mean, we shouldn't throw the baby with the bathwater. So let's carry all that, but be very brutally realistic about the new landscape, new modes, new sources, new actors, new incentives going forward. So that would be my message.
Thank you. Pat.
I wanted to say that it is really important for us to just invest in people, build the capability of our public servants, build the capability of our private sector operators and our NGO leaders to think differently and be able to empower themselves to take on the ownership of these new designs and innovations that we're talking about. Be able to strengthen our governance. To do that, you have to have the skill to do so. And just invest in that. I think that is this capability building agenda has been continually underinvested in general across the board. Let's build our skills for this future opportunity so that we can have all the necessary soft infrastructure in place when the hard skills are needed to build the technical things that we'd like to roll out.
I think I'll try to 3 points very short, Anthea. First, learn from the previous mistakes. And the second one is be embraced with the uncertainties. And the last but not least is trying to find different ways of thinking, especially in terms of the global aid landscape, not only focusing on what is being going on, and then especially conventional way, but trying to be much more creative and also in the more embracing in more uncertainties kind of situation. Thank you, Anthea.
Fantastic, really. Nicola, I hope you were writing those down. Nicola and I are both going to the conference, and so I think we've got great talking points for ourselves now for there. Thank you so much. That was super insightful. I'm going to try to wrap up now first by thanking all the speakers so much. This was a fantastic, far-reaching, very deep and thoughtful discussion. And what we've heard today reinforces that global development cooperation is in the midst of a fundamental transition driven by the declining centrality of traditional aid, shifting financial flows, rising regional leadership, and growing geopolitical complexity. And this is neither entirely a crisis nor purely a catalyst. It is a complex reconfiguration, as we've seen through the discussion today. And in Asia, while ODA continues to play an important role, it's still important, especially in fragile states and critical areas like nutrition or humanitarian relief. It is no longer the dominant pillar. And the future lies in a more diverse cooperation landscape that looks at ongoing North-South cooperation, but also expanding South-South cooperation, the growing interest in triangular cooperation. And we also need to rethink how aid works beyond the traditional donor-driven conditionalities. We need to embrace trust-based, context-sensitive partnerships, and also recognize Asia's unique ecosystem of private capital, from micro, small, and medium enterprises to philanthropic family firms with a longer-term relational approach to development. There's a real potential to unlock financing within Asia, but doing so demands realism, better alignment between profit and purpose, and structures built for the region, not borrowed from the North. And geopolitics, while we know this is not new, it's increasingly shaping the priorities in the region. And we need to find ways to safeguard long-term goals like climate action, like global public goods, from short-term political agendas. And as we reimagine this landscape, Asia must assert its centrality, not just as a recipient or a donor, but really as a co-designer of new norms and models of cooperation. So with that, thank you all very much. We're going to put up a quick slide so I can let you know about the next steps. While that slide is going up, I would like to sincerely thank the Australian government and DFAT, who has been supporting this area of work for the Asia Foundation. We're incredibly grateful. So stay tuned for some future events. So this is our program, the Future of Development Cooperation. We've got other things coming up. The conference, as we mentioned, we've got some country level dialogues happening across Asia. We have another public webinar coming up in August, TBC, so watch this space. We have blog posts coming up. And also, if you want to contact us, there is an address down there. So again, thank you so much. I hope this is not the last time we can have this conversation. It was incredibly rich, and I'm sure we'll find a way to get all of you together again. And thank you so much for our audience for the excellent questions. We still have a healthy participation after 90 minutes. Have a good rest of the day and evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Are we off?